This video is about intervals. An interval is a continuous section on the number line. And in order to talk about this some more, we first need to draw a number line. Now one such continuous section could be the section starting at -2 and ending at +1, and we look at everything in between these two numbers. I use an open circle to indicate that -2 or -1 is not part of the section, so not part of the interval. Let's call this interval 1. Now, in this case, we have an open interval because the two boundaries are not part of the interval. Then this section can be written down as all values for x, such that -2 is strictly smaller than x, and x in turn is strictly smaller than 1. So x is in between -2 and 1. -2 and 1 are not part of the interval, so I use the strictly smaller than signs. Another interval could be from -3 to -1. And in this interval I use colored dots to indicate that the boundary numbers, -3 and -1, are part of the interval. We call this a closed interval. Now this interval can also be written down as all x such that -3 is smaller or equal than x, which in turn is smaller or equal than -1. It's a closed interval, the boundary numbers are included, so -3 is smaller or equal to x, which is in turn smaller or equal to -1. Now let's look at the following section. Starting at 0, where 0 is part of the interval, ending at +3, where 3 is not part of the interval. We call these kinds of intervals half-closed. And this can also be written down as 0 is smaller or equal to x, which is in turn strictly smaller than 3. There are two more intervals to consider. The first is the interval starting at 4 and then continuing ever onward until infinity. We can write this down as all values of x that are larger or equal to 4. There's no number on the other side because x only has one boundaries. In this case we use the larger equal sign instead of the smaller equal sign because we want to give our interval notation with starting at x whenever possible. In this case it makes more sense to start at the lowest number and then move up to the highest number, so same here and same here. But in this case we start with x and we say x is larger or equal than 4. And lastly, we can look at the interval where -5 is not part of the interval, but everything smaller than -5 is, and we can write that down as x is strictly smaller, x is strictly smaller than -5. Now this notation using x between two numbers or x is larger equal than, x is smaller than, or smaller equal, or etc. is something you will use a lot this year. Next year we will also learn another notation for intervals, which I will also discuss for the complete picture. When x is between two numbers, we can also write down those two numbers with a comma in between. And in the case that they are not part of the intervals, we use triangular brackets. In the case they are part of the interval, we use rectangular brackets. So this is the interval from -2 to 1, where the boundaries are not in the interval. This is the interval from -3 to -1, where the boundaries are. So this interval can be written down as 0 to 3. 0 is part of the interval, so we use a rectangular brackets. 3 is not part of the interval, so we use a triangular brackets. This is the interval starting at 4 going to infinity. 4 is part of the interval, infinity is not. And in this interval, the interval starts at -infinity and continues on to -5. -infinity is not part of the interval, and -5 in this case is also not part of the interval. What you should remember from this video is that you can write down a section of the number line as all values of x between two numbers, or larger than or smaller than a number. Please note that you use the correct signs, and it depends on the context whether you have to use smaller than something or smaller equal than something.